The old-timer spoke to the old man. The old man talked to his son Jack, and he told him, don't forget who the fuck he owes. He knows who the fuck he owes.
Al Capone understood America better than America understood itself. They call Capone a bootlegger, he said at the height of his power. What's Al done? He supplied a legitimate demand. To him, organized crime wasn't a sin, it was a business. Capone wrapped himself in a public image of a civic-minded businessman, a provider of the very vices people secretly wanted. Many bought the act, ignoring the engine behind his empire. Cold-blooded murder. The violence was often dressed up as business necessity. Even decades later, the myth endured. Dean Jennings, writing about Benjamin Bugsy Siegel in 1967, titled his biography, "We Only Kill Each Other," a slogan that made murder sound almost gentlemanly. Public attitudes never fully hardened. By the 1970s, gangster chic replaced the radical chic of the previous decade. Socialites courted killers. Marta Orbach, a fashionable New York hostess, invited Joseph Crazy Joe Gallo, a mafia hitman, to her Sunday brunches. Comedian David Steinberg and playwright Neil Simon sipped coffee with a man who had blood on his hands. That ended on April 7th, 1972, when Gallo was gunned down at Umberto's Clam House on Mulberry Street during his 43rd birthday dinner. 4 months later, the violence spilled over again. A short, heavy-set man stepped into a Manhattan bar, drank a glass of water, pulled out 2 pistols, and opened fire. 9 shots. 2 kosher meat dealers dead, 2 more gravely wounded. The victims weren't targets. They'd simply taken the seats of men from Joseph Colombo's crew. Police believed the shooter was avenging Gallo's murder. It was a brutal reminder. Organized crime has no boundaries. It touches anyone, anywhere. When I use a word, Humpty Dumpty said, it means what I choose it to mean. The same goes for organized crime. The phrase can refer to the crimes, bootlegging, gambling, prostitution, or to the groups that commit them. Sometimes the term distinguishes between the enterprise, which sells illegal goods and services, and the syndicate, which regulates those enterprises, dividing territory, settling disputes, offering protection from rivals and law enforcement. These syndicates range from local crews to sprawling international networks. Some handle everything from narcotics to gambling, others stick to one racket. The public still calls them the mafia or the mob, but inside the life, the names vary. In Chicago, it's the outfit. In Buffalo, the arm. In New York, La Cosa Nostra. The labels have fueled stereotypes about Italian Americans, but as mob informant Joseph Valachi put it, I'm not talking about Italians, I'm talking about criminals. The ethnic character of organized crime was shaped by history, not biology. Crime is not the trait of any people, it's the pursuit of power by those willing to break the law. Organized crime is woven into America's fabric. The pirates who prowled colonial waters were among the first. Revolution-era smugglers, including John Hancock himself, financed rebellion by breaking the law. The 19th century brought new forms, violent street gangs born of ethnic tension and poverty in cities like New York and San Francisco, highwaymen and slave catchers in the West, river pirates like Jean Lafitte, who fought for the United States in the War of 1812. After the Civil War, gangs led by dominant personalities, the James Boys, the Daltons, the Youngers, rose and fell with their leaders. As cities grew, so did organized crime. Late 19th and early 20th century gangs formed alliances with new money and new political machines. In New York, the first crews were Irish. A scientific study in 1881 even declared the Irish criminal by nature, pointing out that, though a minority of the population, they made up most of the prison population. By the turn of the century, Jewish gangsters had become a force. Police Commissioner Theodore Bingham noted that while Jews were only 25% of New York's population, they committed half the city's crimes. Prohibition supercharged everything. Arnold Rothstein, immortalized by F. Scott Fitzgerald in The Great Gatsby and accused of fixing the 1919 World Series, built empires from liquor, gambling, and corruption. By the mid-1930s, Italian mobsters in the Northeast and Midwest had seized a dominant, though not total, share of the underworld. The federal government's first real attempt to confront organized crime came in 1950, when Attorney General J. Howard McGrath, pushed by mayors and municipal leaders, called a national conference on organized crime. On February 15th, law enforcement officials from across the country met in Washington to face a grim reality. Organized crime wasn't local anymore. It was national, even international. New Orleans Mayor de Lesseps Morrison spoke for many. "We do not have the whole picture," he said, "but each of us has seen a small segment of this national scene. These pieces fit together into mounting evidence of several highly organized syndicates whose wealth, power, and influence have grown to alarming proportions." Morrison described the Capone gang's grip on the wire service that fed horse racing results to bookies nationwide, and the gambling empires of Frank Costello, Phil Castile, and Carlos Marcello in Louisiana. Dallas District Attorney Will Wilson told of slot machines and punchboards shipped from Chicago and enforced by dealing in killing of the most reckless kind. A bomb meant for a policeman killed his wife instead. The officer survived a later ambush, only to be shot through a hospital window. Not everyone agreed. Otto Kerner, U.S. Attorney in Chicago, denied the existence of any organized gambling in his city. "I have read about the Capone syndicate in the newspapers," he said. "I have never received any evidence of it." Los Angeles Mayor Fletcher Brown shot back, "This is no fiction about organized crime. It is a reality, and it extends from one end of the nation to the other." The conference planted a seed. Some participants would later shape federal efforts against organized crime. Texas Attorney General Price Daniel, who became a U.S. Senator, pushed through tough narcotics laws in 1956 that brought down syndicate leaders. Others fell from grace. Kerner became Illinois governor and a U.S. appeals judge, but in 1973 he was convicted of taking $150,000 in bribes from horse racing interests. Vincent Keogh, U.S. Attorney in Brooklyn turned New York Supreme Court Justice, was convicted in 1962 with mobster Anthony Corallo for trying to influence a bankruptcy case. Vincent's brother Eugene, a close ally of President Kennedy, was described by Robert F. Kennedy as one of the 5 people most helpful to JFK's 1960 campaign. In 1948, America was riding high. The Marshall Plan was stabilizing Europe, prosperity was booming at home, and Harry Truman had shocked the nation with a come-from-behind election victory. Within 2 years, the mood soured. China fell to communism, the economy stumbled, and influence-peddling scandals rocked the Truman administration. Congress was restless. Morrison pressed again, this time for a full investigation of organized crime. Senator Estes Kefauver of Tennessee took up the cause. Drawing on a 1948 California Crime Commission report and his own conversations with reporters, Kefauver introduced Senate Resolution 202 on January 5, 1950, calling for a sweeping probe into organized crime in America. The resolution faced resistance. Democrats feared exposing the ties between gangsters and their own urban political machines. Republicans feared a whitewash. "As I look back on the struggle to get the committee," Kefauver later said, "I sometimes wonder that we were ever able to bring it into existence." In the end, it passed only after Vice President Alban Barkley broke a Senate tie. Kefauver, 46, came from a prominent Tennessee family. A congressman since 1938, he had just entered the Senate, known as a sharp, independent Southern liberal. He insisted on hiring based on competence, not politics. Rudolph Halley, a respected veteran of wartime investigations, became chief counsel. Harold Robinson, who had worked on Earl Warren's California Crime Commission, became chief investigator. Kefauver wanted answers to fundamental questions. Did a national crime syndicate exist? Where did its power come from? How deep were its ties to local government? Many in Washington dismissed him, assuming the investigation would fade quietly. They were wrong. The Kefauver hearings gripped the nation and nearly carried a freshman senator from Tennessee all the way to the White House. The Kefauver Committee ran the first national dragnet on organized crime from May 10, 1950 to May 1, 1951. Kefauver himself logged 52,380 miles and sat through 92 days of hearings. More than 800 witnesses paraded through rooms in Miami, Kansas City, St. Louis, Philadelphia, Chicago, Tampa, Cleveland, Detroit, New Orleans, Las Vegas, San Francisco, Los Angeles, Saratoga, and New York City. The New York sessions went live on television and pulled in an estimated 30 million viewers. On the eve of opening day, Attorney General J. Howard McGrath said justice already had persuasive evidence of a national crime syndicate. Kefauver set out to show it. The committee's primary target was professional gambling, especially casinos, running wide open across the country. Bookmaking was just as common, with illegal slot machines and punchboards everywhere. The finding was blunt. Professional gambling was the principal bankroll for big-time racketeering and gangsterism. Narcotics earned only a quick pass, but even there the panel stamped it highly organized crime. The real breakthrough came in charting how hoodlums muscled into legitimate business. They documented unscrupulous and unethical practices, extortion, corrupted banking, and plain violence, used to bend lawful enterprises, and they logged evidence of hoodlum infiltration in roughly 50 lines of work, from advertising to transportation. Kefauver hit Chicago 3 times and stacked up 1,416 printed pages of testimony, more than any other stop. Otto Kerner had claimed there was no organized gambling in the city. The record shredded that line. Inside Chicago proper there were no casinos running, but just beyond the city limits, especially in Cicero, where corruption was tradition, plush gambling houses did brisk business. Inside the city, the policy racket blanketed neighborhoods, particularly the South Side. The committee put the 5-year haul at $150 million. No small number, alongside Kerner's denial. Chicago was also the factory floor for slot machines and punchboards shipped nationwide, and the hub for the wire service that fed horse race results to bookmakers. What worried the committee most was how openly crime and politics worked together, and how bipartisan it was. On the West Side, Democrat Roland Libonati and Republican James J. Aduzzi surfaced as leaders of a legislative bloc that fraternized with racketeers and strangled reform bills. John Roselli, a Chicago hood at the time, supplied the footnote, the wire service, handbooks, slot machines, the whole setup, couldn't operate without local corruption. If the handbooks were open, it meant the police were getting paid. They rewound the tape on Alphonse Capone, too. In 1924, he was a scarred 23-year-old bodyguard for Johnny Torrio. By 1929, he owned Chicago's underworld, brothels, bootleg beer, gambling. In 1931, the feds nailed him for tax evasion. His organization didn't die with the verdict. It handed off to lieutenants, Jake Greasy Thumb Guzik, Frank Nitti, Felice de Lucia, Paul Ricca, Anthony Accardo, Murray Humphreys, and Capone's cousins, the Fischetti brothers, Charles and Rocco. The turn came from a murder and a ledger. On April 26, 1926, Assistant U.S. Attorney William H. McSwiggan was gunned down. A raid on the Strip, a Cicero gambling house, followed. It wasn't a federal show, but it coughed up what the government needed against Capone. 3 years later, in March 1929, a group of citizens told President Herbert Hoover that Capone ruled Chicago. Hoover ordered every federal outfit to bear down. The plan was two-pronged. Frank J. Wilson assembled a special IRS unit to dissect Capone's tax life. Elliot Ness ran a Prohibition Bureau team after Capone's beer empire. Ness's work was the hotter seat. Wiretapping Capone's headquarters was the only way to stay a step ahead of the gunman. That Cicero raid turned out a dusty cash book. A bank deposit slip tied it to Lou Shumway, a Capone bookkeeper. Paper chases through the banks led to Fred Rice, another insider. Both men were turned. Shumway was stashed in California until trial. Rice was shipped to South America. Their testimony anchored charges that Capone failed to file income tax returns for 1924, 1928, and 1929, and evaded taxes from 1925 through 1929. A separate prohibition indictment never reached trial because the tax case hit first and hard. The government's proof was simple and devastating: specific items of unreported income and a life spent like a sultan. Capone's lawyer, Albert Fink, moaned that this prosecution existed only because of the defendant's name. U.S. Attorney George E.Q. Johnson answered in open court. Ordinary people scraping past $1,500 a year paid their taxes. Why should a man with $250, diamond belt buckles, and $27 shirts get a pass? Johnson said the case would matter to future generations, not because of the name Alphonse Capone, but because it would decide whether a man could climb so far above the law, he escaped it. On October 17, 1931, 11 days after the trial opened, the jury got the case. They deliberated 8 hours and split hairs, not guilty on failing to file in 1924, guilty on 5 of the remaining counts. On October 24th, Capone drew 2 consecutive 5-year terms and a $50,000 fine. He did 2 years in Atlanta before a transfer to Alcatraz, where he sat until 1939. He came out a broken man, showing the unmistakable signs of paresis, mind and body stripped by untreated syphilis. The tax conviction ended the career, but not the story. Because he was never tried for his other crimes, the public never saw the full picture. Capone was born January 17, 1899, in Brooklyn, to Italian parents who had come from Naples in 1883. He died in 1947. His legend is pegged to blood. The St. Valentine's Day massacre in 1929 left 7 men torn apart by machine gun fire. One survivor, Frank Gusenberg, lived long enough to hear the question and spit out a code answer: "Nobody shot me. I ain't no copper." Capone personally ordered killings that never made a docket, including the bat murder of 3 enemies at a dinner thrown in their honor: Giuseppe Giunta, Albert Anselmi, and John Scalise, officers of the Unione Siciliana, founded in 1895 and by 1928 converted into a mafia front. No witnesses ever stood up in a murder trial to say his name. Until the federal tax case, Al Capone floated above the law. Power in Chicago shifted the way it always does in the rackets, quietly, then violently. After Capone, the Kefauver Committee said, control moved to Frank Nitti, who killed himself in 1943 while under indictment in a headline extortion case aimed at Hollywood. From there it passed to Felice de Lucia, and then to Anthony Accardo, a former Capone bodyguard who may have helped plan the St. Valentine's Day massacre. The faces changed. The business didn't. When the Kefauver spotlight swung to Chicago, the syndicate answered in its own language. 2 key witnesses, ex-police captain William Drury and attorney Marvin J. Bass, were murdered before they could testify. Kefauver didn't mince words. Organized crime and political corruption, he said, run together. There is no big-time racket without a profitable alliance between the men who operate it and the men who hold office. Voters drew the same conclusion. An election followed one of the Chicago trips, and on November 7, 1950, a string of Democrats went down, including Senate Majority Leader Scott Lucas, who blamed his loss to Everett M. Dirksen on the hearings. In de Lesseps Morrison's New Orleans, the pattern matched Chicago's map. No casinos inside the city. Just across the parish line, in Jefferson and St. Bernard, plush houses ran hard. The panel called it one of the largest concentrations of gambling in America. The Beverly Club was the showpiece, with nightclub entertainment and big city ownership. Phil Castile, Frank Costello, Jake Lansky out of New York, and Carlos Marcello, identified by the committee as New Orleans Mafia boss. Costello had imported the slot machine racket in the mid-1930s after cutting a deal with Senator Huey P. Long, this after New York Mayor-elect Fiorello LaGuardia threatened to banish him. When Morrison won City Hall in 1946, the operation shifted to the neighboring parishes. Inside New Orleans, illegal pinball machines still flourished, greased by corruption. The committee found the usual alliance: gangsters and compromised sheriffs, marshals, and other lawmen. The committee's profile was blunt. Carlos Marcello, born February 6, 1910, in Tunisia to Sicilian parents, brought to New Orleans later that year, first bore the name Calogero Minacor. It became Marcella, then the masculine Marcello. He worked every angle: casinos, horse betting parlors, slot machines, narcotics. He poured money into legitimate fronts: bars, restaurants, inns, seafood processors, frozen foods. His contacts ran national: Costello in New York, Joseph Civello in Dallas, Sam Yaras in Chicago, Mickey Cohen in Los Angeles. The New Orleans pipeline even supplied the guns for a mafia murder in Tampa, where Santo Trafficante Jr. had been the reputed boss for more than 20 years. City by city, Kefauver looked even-handed and hard-nosed. Opposition grew anyway. Senator Pat McCarran of Nevada fumed over the Las Vegas findings. It didn't matter. New York was next. The hearings opened March 12, 1951. For 8 days, 40 witnesses walked in cocky and walked out rattled, caught in Rudolph Halley's questions and Kefauver's cool, methodical pressure. This time the panel put names on the alliance: Frank Costello and William O'Dwyer. Frank Costello was born Francesco Castiglia on January 26, 1918, in Loropoli, Calabria. At 4, he landed in New York with parents who swapped rural poverty for urban squalor. By the time of the hearings, he was living well: a West Side apartment, a summer place in Sands Point, annual trips to Florida, New Orleans, and Hot Springs. He styled himself a legitimate businessman: real estate, oil, politics, only as a friend, not a practitioner. The committee painted a different picture: a prohibition bootlegger who moved into the legal liquor trade, a casino and slot machine owner, a bookmaker. His syndicate roster read like a roll call: Meyer Lansky, Joe Adonis, Willie Moretti, Abner Zwillman, Vito Genovese, Joseph Profaci, with associations to Joseph Lanza, Charles Luciano, and Carlos Marcello. The committee credited him with dominating Tammany Hall by 1942. The proof was unusually clean: wiretaps by Manhattan D, a Frank Hogan that showed Costello as both political boss and underworld emperor. William O'Dwyer's path ran through City Hall. He wore a badge from 1917 to 1924, left to practice law, won a judgeship in 1938, and in 1940 became district attorney of Kings County, covering Brooklyn. His office chased more than 20 gangland murders and broke open Murder, Inc. with the help of hitman Abe Relis, who flipped. The outfit, headed by Albert Anastasia, said to report to Joe Adonis, staffed by Jewish gunmen, took contracts in New York and beyond. On November 12, 1941, before an indictment could land on Anastasia, Relis fell 6 stories from a guarded room in the Half Moon Hotel at Coney Island. The committee said there was little evidence O'Dwyer ever intended to indict Anastasia, who kept a stranglehold on the Brooklyn waterfront through an ILA local. The murder inquest probe, they found, had glaring deficiencies. O'Dwyer still rode it into the mayor's office in 1945. By the time of the hearings, he was U.S. ambassador to Mexico. The committee's bottom line, from DA to mayor, his choices, action or inaction, often broke in favor of men suspected of being high in the rackets. To show how national the business had become, the committee dissected the racing wire, the real-time results pipeline bookies needed the way brokers need a stock ticker. The dominant firm, Continental Press, sat under the old Capone syndicate. The line began in the 1920s with Nationwide News Service, founded by H.L. Moe Annenberg, with James A. Reagan, Sr. as his key man. Under monopoly heat and a tax inquiry, Annenberg divested in 1939. His legitimate holdings grew into Triangle Publications, publisher of TV Guide. The Wire morphed into Continental Press. By 1946, Reagan controlled it, and that's when the wolves came. Mickey Cohen and Joseph Seeker, for West Coast boss Jack Dragner, tried to force their way in. A Chicago firm tied to Anthony Accardo and the Capone crowd, H&H Publishing, launched competition. A rival national service, Trans-America, began edging Continental out in places like New Orleans. On June 24, 1946, Reagan was blasted with a shotgun in classic mob style. 3 months later, he died of mercury poisoning, even under police guard. Witnesses named Lenny Patrick, Dave Yaras, and William Block as the gunman. 1 witness was murdered, 2 recanted, another fled. The case collapsed. The Capone syndicate took Continental without another shot. Carlos Marcello became the New Orleans distributor. Dragner got a $50,000 service contract. Bookies everywhere had a choice: deal with the syndicate's front and pay, or close. Kefauver wanted the blueprint. The committee's conclusion was stark. Prohibition birthed new kinds of criminal gangs. In the 30 years since, organized crime turned multi-purpose. Any racket, anywhere there was money. The Mafia played a binding role, tying major gangs and freelance hoodlums into a loose association. Its authority rested on 2 things: muscle and murder, and it eliminated anyone in the way. Beyond mapping the structure, concrete wins were thin. One key law, the Johnson Act, put interstate gambling devices under federal control. Most other proposals stalled until the Kennedy administration pushed them through Congress in 1961. Scholars split on the legacy. William Moore argued Kefauver chased headlines and that the national syndicate idea was wrong. But the country was paying attention. The hearings woke the public to organized crime. Professional politicians, urban bosses, angry legislators, white Southern power brokers, and a resentful lame duck president kept Kefauver from the Democratic nomination in 1952 and 1956. He snagged the vice presidential slot with Adlai Stevenson in 1956, after a down-to-the-wire roll call against a junior senator from Massachusetts named John F. Kennedy. The Republicans won in November. The mob slipped out of sight until November 14, 1957. Appalachian, New York. A quiet fall day, November 14, 1957. Sergeant Edgar D. Croswell of the New York State Police had been watching the 130-acre estate of Joseph Barbara Sr. on McFall Road, a narrow dirt strip off Old Route 17 that ran to Appalachian Creek. Barbara, who sold Canada Dry, had history: bootlegging, gangster company, whispers about murders. In 1956, he hosted a meeting at Binghamton's Arlington Hotel with names like Carmine Galante, John Bonventre, and Joseph Bonanno. Croswell figured Barbara was the man behind Broome County's rackets. On November 13th, Croswell and another trooper clocked out-of-state plates at the Parkway Motel in nearby Vestal. Rooms had been reserved by Joseph Barbara Jr. Some guests never signed in, but were clearly staying. Croswell tipped the Alcohol and Tobacco Tax Division. It could be another bootleg summit like 1956. The next day, around 12:40 p.m., Croswell, his partner, and 2 federal agents drove up to the Barbara place to take plate numbers. They expected a handful of cars. They found 8 to 10 in one lot and 20 to 25 more by a barn. As they backed out, 8 to 10 men came out from behind a garage. Sharp suits, dark clothes, the uniform of the trade. Hoodlums. They set a checkpoint on Old Route 17 at McFall Road, the only way out. From there they watched the meeting break up around 1:20 p.m. Some men bolted into the woods. Others headed for the road. The first car reached the checkpoint at 1:25. 5 men inside. The driver, Russell Bufalino of Pittston, Pennsylvania. Croswell knew him for a stolen property arrest. A passenger, Vito Genovese of New Jersey. An extensive criminal background, Croswell noted. "What are you doing in this area?" he asked. "I don't think I have to answer your question, do I?" Genovese said. "No," Croswell answered and waved them through. Between 1:20 and 2:30, 25 men passed the checkpoint. Others were grabbed in the woods or on side roads. In the end, 59 were identified at Barbara's house, carrying more than $300,000 in cash. From New York City, Joseph Bonanno, Joseph Magliocco, Carlo Gambino, Carmine Lombardozzi, Joseph Profaci, John Bonventre. From Niagara Falls, Anthony Magadino. From New Jersey, Gerardo Catena, Joseph Ida, Frank Maggiore. From California, Frank DeSimone. From Texas, Joseph Civello. From Havana, Santo Trafficante Jr. The country now had what it hadn't before, an accidental roll call of a national syndicate, caught in the open on a dead-end road in upstate New York. Appalachian yanked organized crime back into the spotlight. Investigations fired overnight by the FBI, IRS, Immigration and Naturalization, the Alcohol and Tobacco Tax Division, federal and state grand juries, big city police in New York, Los Angeles, Dallas, and committees of both the New York and U.S. Senates. There were 133 examinations of attendees, including 27 appearances before federal grand juries, and 29 FBI interviews. Most men, like Vito Genovese, said nothing. The ones who talked claimed they were visiting a sick friend. That was Russell Bufalino's line. Frank DeSimone said he'd come east to see an eye doctor, and the Bufalino had invited him and his cousin Joe Civello to a party. Civello told Dallas Police Chief Carl Hansen that Russ, a man he didn't know until New York, had invited him to a barbecue and a crap game. Not one of them admitted to anything more than coincidence. The government didn't buy it. Joseph Barbara Sr. had ordered 207 pounds of steak, 20 pounds of veal cutlets, and 15 pounds of luncheon meats on November 5, 1957. A federal grand jury indicted 27 men for conspiracy to obstruct justice and perjury. After 8 weeks, a jury convicted. On January 13, 1960, Judge Irving R. Kaufman entered the verdict. Among the 84 witnesses was Robert F. Kennedy, former chief counsel to a Senate committee that had run its own probe. He punctured Joe Profaci's claim that he barely spoke English. Profaci had carried on with Kennedy in perfect English, broken perfect English, about a partner who died and a courtesy call on Barbara. On appeal, the Second Circuit reversed. Suspicion wasn't proof. Maybe falsity, the court said, but no clear agreement to tell false stories. Judge Charles Clark added, there wasn't a shred of legal evidence that the gathering was illegal or improper in purpose or fact. For law enforcement, which was the wall. Appalachian happened. Everyone knew what it meant, except on paper. Even with immunity, the government couldn't crack the silence or stop perjury. Some witnesses did months in jail on civil contempt rather than talk or answered with evasion. What the public learned next came through the Senate Select Committee on Improper Activities in the labor or management field, the McClellan Committee. The chair was John L. McClellan. The engine was his chief counsel, Robert F. Kennedy. In late 1956, Kennedy went west, Los Angeles, Portland, Seattle, and stopped in Chicago on December 20th. He'd been taking a hard look at labor racketeering. He reached a blunt conclusion. Dave Beck was a crook. Beck was president of the International Brotherhood of Teamsters. That meant a full Senate probe. A select committee formed with McClellan as chair and Senator John F. Kennedy on the roster. Bobby wanted me on that committee, JFK later said, to keep it more balanced, not just anti-labor. Created January 30th, 1957, the committee moved fast. In year one, the staff traveled 650,000 miles, interviewed 16,000 witnesses in 44 states, and held 104 hearing days with 486 witnesses. They found Beck had looted the rank and file, over $32,000 in loans, and more than $370,000 in union funds altogether. He'd caved to forces fronting for racketeers. State court convicted him of larceny in 1957. Federal court convicted him of tax evasion in 1959. He would later win a presidential pardon in July 1975. Beck's fall cleared the way for a tougher figure with tighter mob ties, James Riddle Hoffa. Born February 14, 1913, in Brazil, Indiana. Hoffa lost his coal miner father at 7. His mother moved the family to Detroit in 1924 and took assembly line work. Hoffa quit school at 14, stocked shelves. Then, on a Kroger loading dock in 1932, led a work stoppage that became Local 19,341, affiliated with the AFL. In 1935, the local folded into the Teamsters. In 1936, it merged into Local 299, Hoffa's stronghold for the next 4.5 decades. His underworld connections began through Sylvia Pagano, with whom he had an affair. She married Sam Scaradino, later Frank O'Brien, in Kansas City, a rackets man. Her son took the last name Coppola from Frank Coppola, his godfather, a major narcotics smuggler tied to Charles Luciano, Phil Castile, and Carlos Marcello, deported to Italy on January 9, 1948. Through Pagano, Hoffa met Detroit figures like Santo Sam Perrone, strikebreaker and bootlegger, and Angelo Mealy. Their neutrality helped Hoffa win Detroit's first citywide Teamsters strike in April 1937. The alliance helped again in September 1957, when Beck's rigged election collapsed and Hoffa moved up. After Beck, McClellan aimed at Hoffa. Hoffa called it the Kennedy Vendetta. "We were like flint and steel," he said. "Every time we came to grips, the sparks flew." The probe looked at Hoffa's rapid rise and power grab, dicey deals with trucking companies, and his ties to underworld figures including John DioGuardi, Anthony Corallo, and Paul Dorfman. DioGuardi was a 3-time convicted labor racketeer and a suspect in the acid blinding of columnist Victor Riesel, who had been exposing union corruption. The case died when the actual assailant was found dead, and witnesses folded. Identified later with the Lucchese family, DioGuardi took over an Allied industrial workers local in 1950, aided by Paul Dorfman, Chicago mob associate and head of a waste handlers local. As DioGuardi grew, he pulled in Corallo, whom the committee called a long-term kingpin in narcotics and labor rackets, later identified as a Lucchese capo regime. Together they jammed the local with 40 men arrested 178 times and convicted 77 times. For theft, narcotics, extortion, bookmaking, assault, robbery, burglary, forgery, murder. After joining, 25 more indictments and convictions followed for extortion, perjury, bribery, forgery. The union sold out workers, often black and Puerto Rican, who paid high initiation fees and dues for low wages, no benefits, no seniority, and grim conditions. Despite the record, Hoffa backed DeGuardi and Corallo. State wiretaps, obtained from Manhattan DA Frank Hogan, caught Hoffa aiding their 1954 taxi drive against Thomas Hickey. Hickey represented Hoffa's own Teamsters. In 1956, Hoffa pushed their local into the Teamsters and seized joint counsel number 16, the power center for New York's 58 Teamsters locals. He also backed the corrupt International Longshoremen's Association against the AFL. In July 1957, before hearings on the DeGuardi-Corallo local, Hoffa beat a bribery case involving a committee lawyer, John Cy Chisti. Even with a marked exchange and a same-day arrest, Hoffa walked, helped by star defense attorney Edward Bennett Williams, his own combative testimony, and a thin prosecution. Back at the committee in August, Hoffa dodged the fifth and claimed bad memory. Kennedy used the lawful wiretaps to pin him down. "He can say forcefully someone's a liar," Kennedy said later, "but here we had his own voice." He couldn't deny it. Hoffa wasn't finished. A New York wiretapping indictment ended in a hung jury, then an acquittal in spring 1958. A perjury case died after a 1957 Supreme Court ruling barred state wiretap evidence. The committee returned in 1958 with more on Hoffa. He kept his seat. The fight would move from hearing room to courtroom later. After November 14, 1957, McClellan turned to organized crime structure and roster. In June and July 1958, the committee profiled the Appalachian men. Of 59 identified, 50 had arrest records, 35 had convictions, 23 had done time. 18 had been arrested or questioned in murder cases, 15 for narcotics, 30 for gambling, 23 for firearms violations. Legitimate business. 9 were in coin machines, 16 in garment or trucking, 10 owned groceries or markets, 11 ran taverns or restaurants, 11 dealt in olive oil/cheese import, export, 9 in construction. Others held pieces of auto agencies, coal companies, clubs, funeral homes, horses and tracks, paint and laundry, trucking firms, waterfront unions, bakeries. 1 led a dance orchestra. The committee didn't accept the chance meeting story, citing extensive pre-meeting phone traffic among the men. Chairman McClellan put it on the record. A close-knit, clandestine criminal syndicate made fortunes in prohibition liquor, then narcotics, vice, gambling, and poured illicit profits into legitimate business. It wasn't local, it was national. Robert Kennedy measured the money another way, by Mickey Cohen's lifestyle. $275, silk lounging pajamas, a $25,000 bulletproof car, 300 suits, 150 pairs of socks, 60 pairs of $60 shoes. The power matched the luxury. Hollywood moved to film Kennedy's The Enemy Within. Bud Schulberg wrote the script for Columbia Pictures. When William Bufalino, Hoffa's lawyer, conveyed that 20th Century Fox had quietly shelved its own corruption feature for fear Teamsters drivers wouldn't deliver prints, Columbia backed off. The Enemy Within never got made. In separate remarks attached to the report, Senator Kennedy called the syndicate a nationwide, highly organized and highly effective internal enemy, and pressed for new racketeer control tools. The McClellan work was massive. Over roughly 3 years, 270 hearing days, 1,526 witnesses, 46,150 transcript pages across 59 volumes, 2.5 million miles traveled, 8,000 subpoenas issued. One witness in 5 invoked the 5th. Officials of 15 unions and more than 50 companies were exposed for illicit practices, often under mob domination. Kennedy came away convinced. If the nation didn't attack organized criminals with weapons and techniques as effective as theirs, they would destroy us. January 20th, 1961. Chief Justice Earl Warren swore in John F. Kennedy as the 35th president. Bright, clear, bitter cold over fresh snow. On the Capitol's east steps, the contrasts were stark. Eisenhower 79 Protestant Midwestern conservative, Kennedy 43 Catholic Northeastern liberal. 8 years versus the promise of 1,000 days. As president-elect, Kennedy had asked his brother in Hyannisport if he wanted to be Attorney General. Robert said no. He'd been chasing bad men for 3 years and didn't want to spend a lifetime at it. In the end, the president told him he needed him. Robert Kennedy didn't have a choice. As Attorney General, Robert F. Kennedy set his sights on 3 fronts: poverty in the justice system, civil rights, and, above all, organized crime. In his first interview, he told Peter Maas of Look that the mob was priority 1. At his first press conference, he said the drive had the president's backing and needed the country's. Inside justice, his line was simple: "Don't tell me what I can't do. Tell me what I can." Before Kennedy, recalled Henry Peterson of the Organized Crime and Racketeering section, people would ask you to define it. Robert Kennedy came in and said, "Don't define it. Do something about it." The obstacles were real. As late as January 1962, J. Edgar Hoover insisted no single individual or coalition dominated organized crime nationwide. Whether Frank Costello ever sold Hoover on that view is unknowable now. Both men are dead. The view itself was fact. And while some of the 26 other federal investigative agencies, like the Bureau of Narcotics, were more receptive, they weren't eager to share intelligence or take direction from justice lawyers. Kennedy didn't fix attitudes. He changed performance. Hoover argued the FBI lacked jurisdiction to chase syndicate crime. Kennedy pushed Congress for the interstate racketeering statutes, first floated by Kefauver and ignored for years. He failed to get wiretap authority, but expanded the organized crime and racketeering section from 17 attorneys to 60 between 1960 and 1964, pooled criminal intelligence across agencies, and drew up a target list. Mickey Cohen and John Roselli in the West, Anthony Accardo and Sam Giancana in the Midwest, Carlos Marcello and Santo Trafficante Jr. in the South, and a long run of Appalachian men in the Northeast. By 1964, the list ran to 2,300 top figures and associates, and the section's master file held 175,000 cards. Kennedy's play with the IRS showed how he moved the government. He backed Mortimer Kaplan for commissioner, but only after confirming Kaplan would press racketeer tax cases. Kennedy knew the criticism. Tax laws raise revenue, not punish gangsters. Ramsey Clark believed that even applying tax criteria, it wasn't okay to select organized crime cases. Kennedy called that argument specious. Revenue was a feature, not a bug. While he held the job, IRS civilly assessed top racketeers roughly $250 million beyond what they'd reported. He told IRS agents the priority came from the top, the president himself. Words weren't the point. Regional directors who balked were transferred. IRS man days on OC investigations jumped from 8,836 in 1960 to 96,182 in 1964. A 1967 presidential commission found about 60% of OC prosecutions from 1961 to 1965 started as tax cases. Kennedy pushed laws and cases and also put the mob back on television. Working with Senator John L. McClellan, he launched comprehensive hearings on September 25, 1963, into the national structure of La Cosa Nostra. The star witness was Joseph Valachi, the first made man to testify publicly about the organization. McClellan set the frame. They would examine existence, growth, operations, impact, cost to the economy, and the strengths and failures of existing laws. Cosa Nostra, he said, tried to be a government unto itself, ordering murder for power grabs, vengeance, rivalries, infidelity to the code, and suspicions of betrayal. Kennedy led off as witness. Based on intelligence from Valachi and other informants, he said Cosa Nostra was run by a commission, 9 to 12 men, with city bosses responsible to it. He outlined the program, leaders identified, major cases indicted or under investigation. It is an organization. It is the Mafia. It is the Cosa Nostra. Solving murders was hard by design. Top men insulated themselves. One gave a word to a lieutenant who spoke to another, who passed it to the trigger man, who never knew who ordered it. Tracing it back was nearly impossible. And while syndicate figures were moving into businesses and unions, he warned they hadn't left gambling and narcotics behind. Brutal killings continued. Hardly a week passed without a gangland murder or a witness strangled and dumped. Law enforcement from across the country filled in the map. Families, bosses, underbosses, consiglieri, caporegime, crews, rackets. Valachi supplied the inside history of New York and the Genovese family. The numbers told the story. In 1960, section attorneys spent 61 days in court, 690 in the field, and 100 before grand juries. In 1963, 1,081 court days, 6,177 field days, 1,353 grand jury days. Indicted individuals rose from 121, 1961, to 615, 1963. Convictions, always lagging, rose from 71, 1961, to 288, 1963. Between 1960 to 1964, 116 men, later identified as La Cosa Nostra, were hit in racketeering indictments, including Anthony Accardo, tax evasion, in Chicago; Anthony Provenzano, extortion, in New Jersey; Alfred Sika, tax evasion, in California; Joseph Valachi, narcotics, in New York; Angelo Bruno, extortion, in Philadelphia; Carlos Marcello, conspiracy, in New Orleans; Carmine Lombardozzi, tax evasion, in New York; Anthony Giacalone, tax evasion, in Detroit; Joseph Glimko, unlawful payments, in Chicago; Mickey Cohen, not LCN, went down on taxes. For the first time, the mob felt sustained pressure. Beyond committees and cameras, real cases with real time. Robert M. Morgenthau summed it up. When enough top players are taken off the field and there are no substitutes, the team starts to break. That's what was happening. Until November 22nd, 1963. After Dallas, the heat bled out. The FBI stopped sending a car for the Attorney General. IRS enthusiasm cooled. The program sagged. By 1966, section attorneys were down to 48. Court days fell to 606. Field days to 3,480. Grand jury days to 373. IRS participation dropped to 74,938 man days in 1966 and 42,120 by 1968. The pressure eased. Momentum carried a while. McClellan resumed hearings in July-August 1964 and filed a three-part final report on March 4, 1965, focusing on syndicate narcotics and consolidating the Valachi record. The 1963 Attorney General's report, Kennedy's, called Valachi a significant breakthrough that let justice prove conclusively the nationwide organization known as Cosa Nostra. McClellan agreed Valachi was credible and accurate about structure. Not everyone bought it. Ralph de Toledano echoed Hoover-era skepticism. No conviction rested on Valachi's testimony alone. Arthur Schlesinger wrote in 1965 that criminologists doubted a centrally organized, all-pervasive mafia. In 1978, he said he found skeptics more persuasive. Professionals on the street saw it differently. Ralph Salerno called the Valachi revelations second only to Appalachian, confirmed by bug and wiretap reactions from the men most affected. Police had known pieces. Valachi connected them and showed rank, rules, and relationships. Valachi turned witness only after Vito Genovese marked him for death. He had his revenge, lived under extraordinary protection, and died of natural causes at La Tuna Federal Penitentiary, El Paso, on April 3, 1971. The Teamsters stayed on the board. Kennedy had chased Hoffa as McClellan's counsel. As Attorney General, he kept him high on the list. William Rogers had formed a special group on organized crime to review Appalachian. Kennedy followed with a labor rights squad inside the organized crime and racketeering section, run by Walter Sheridan, to take a fresh look at McClellan's findings and dig into Hoffa and the Union. The press nicknamed it the Get Hoffa Squad. Hoffa claimed on November 15, 1961, that 29 special grand juries and half the department's lawyers and FBI agents were after him. The truth? 13 grand juries, 16 attorneys, roughly 30 agents, with more than Hoffa on their plates, though he was the priority. The count during Kennedy's tenure: 201 Teamster officials and associates indicted, 126 convicted. The big ones had Hoffa's name on them. On May 18, 1962, Hoffa was indicted in Nashville under the Taft-Hartley Act for taking $1 million in illegal payments through Testfleet Corporation, a trucking outfit set up in his wife's name. The trial hung on December 23, 1962. Judge William E. Miller immediately ordered a grand jury on jury tampering. Trial by jury means nothing if corruption turns it into a mockery. The Nashville grand jury indicted Hoffa and 5 others on May 9, 1963, for tampering. Separately, on June 4, 1963, a Chicago grand jury indicted Hoffa and 7 others for fraud. $20 million in loans from the Central States Pension Fund, with $1,090,000 allegedly diverted to themselves. But first, justice moved on Hoffa's lawyer. On November 7, 1963, Walter Sheridan learned that Z.T. Tommy Osborne Jr., a Hoffa attorney, once president of the Tennessee Bar, counsel to the Tennessee Medical Association, and victor in Baker v. Carr, was trying to fix the jury. With the judge's approval, key talks between Osborne and Robert Vick, the go-between, were recorded. Confronted, Osborne denied it until the tape played. Then he cried entrapment. On November 21st, the court disbarred him for a callous and shameful disregard of duty. Osborne was indicted and convicted of endeavoring to obstruct justice and drew 3.5 years, a conviction the Supreme Court upheld in 1966. The money he took in January 1964, $127,500, was traced to a diverted Teamsters pension fund loan. It didn't save his career. He was paroled in April 1969, long after the damage was done. Shifted to Chattanooga, the trial opened January 20, 1964, before Judge Frank W. Wilson, and ran 6 weeks. The case turned on Edward Grady Parton, Secretary-Treasurer of Teamsters Local 5 in Baton Rouge, and a Hoffa insider during the Nashville proceedings, who flipped in September 1962. Parton told justice lawyers that in June 1962 in Washington, Hoffa talked about assassinating Robert Kennedy. He's got to go. An FBI polygraph backed Parton's account. He then fed Walter Sheridan details on Hoffa's push to corrupt the Nashville jury and withstood 5 days of cross. The jury believed him. On March 12, 1964, Judge Wilson gave Hoffa 8 years. You stand here convicted of tampering with the very soul of this nation. Everything we call civilization depends ultimately upon the proper administration of justice. The Supreme Court affirmed in 1966. Chicago came next. Trial opened April 27, 1964. After 13 weeks, Assistant U.S. Attorney William Bittman spent 5.5 hours walking the jury through the pension money, how it moved in intricate and devious channels. Defense star Charles Bellows tried a chart-heavy rebuttal. Judge Richard Austin ordered the jury to disregard exhibits not in evidence. The jury deliberated 17.5 hours. Guilty. On August 17, 1964, Judge Austin tacked 5 more years onto the Chattanooga term. 8 days later, Robert Kennedy, now a private citizen, announced for the U.S. Senate from New York and won in November. Hoffa stayed free until March 1967, when his appeals ran out. 2 iron wills had collided. Kennedy took the late rounds. Hoffa cried frame up. Juries disagreed. Offstage, the pressure was darker. A Chicago plan to fix Judge Miller in Nashville died when no one dared make the offer. A threat aimed at a Supreme Court justice's brother went nowhere. Defense talk of illegal government wiretaps led to a $100,000 offer to J. Edgar Hoover to say it was true. Rumors that U.S. Marshals supplied prostitutes to judge and jury in Chattanooga were aired and discredited. Senator Edward Long of Missouri, friendly to the Teamsters, pushed moves to undercut the program at Justice. Representative Roland Libonati forced a House Judiciary inquiry on September 22, 1964, then left Congress and the push evaporated. NBC's David Brinkley called it pious mouthing, a committee dancing to Jimmy Hoffa's tune. Meanwhile, Carlos Marcello's circle, Pete Rotella and attorney G. Ray Gill, scrambled to produce tapes to help Hoffa, and a reported $1 million war chest appeared for that purpose. None of it worked. On December 23, 1971, President Richard Nixon granted Hoffa clemency without consulting the sentencing judge, and despite 3 unanimous parole board denials, rooted partly in Justice's organized crime warnings. The release barred Hoffa from managing a union, directly or indirectly. Whispers said the restriction was purchased. $500,000 to the Nixon campaign through Anthony Provenzano, a Genovese capo regime, and Teamster power in New Jersey. Out of prison, Hoffa sued to void the restriction and moved to retake the union by 1976, promising, ironically, to cut the mob out. July 30th, 1975. Hoffa left his Detroit home around 1:15 p.m. for the Red Fox restaurant in Bloomfield Township to meet Provenzano and Anthony Giacalone. Neither showed. Both later had airtight alibis. Between 2:45 and 2:50, Hoffa likely got into a maroon Mercury driven by Charles Chucky O'Brien, the son of Hoffa's former lover, Sylvia Pagano. Accounts put at least 2 others in the car, including Salvatore Briguglio, business agent of Local 560, Provenzano's home base. Hoffa was probably knocked out, his hair and blood turned up in the back seat of the Mercury, a car O'Brien had borrowed from Giacalone's son, Joey. O'Brien called Giacalone Uncle Tony. Sylvia O'Brien, who died in 1970, had been Giacalone's girlfriend and a friend of Hoffa's wife, Josephine. Rumors said the women double-dated Giacalone and Anthony Simony until Hoffa appealed to Detroit boss Joseph Zerilli to stop it. Another version had no hitmen in the car. O'Brien drove Hoffa to a nearby house, 4 minutes from the Red Fox, where Salvatore and Gabriel Briguglio and Thomas Andretta, freshly flown in, were waiting. The killing site is disputed, possibly that house without the residents' knowledge. Disposal stories conflict too. A 55-gallon drum to a New Jersey dump, or shredding, compacting, and incineration at Central Sanitation Services in Hamtramck, owned by Detroit LCN members Rafael Quasarano and Peter Vitale, an outfit FBI sources said handled a dozen mob bodies. O'Brien later said, "I never did anything to hurt Jimmy Hoffa." What no one disputes. Hoffa died, and the mob did it. The order was ultimately traced to Russell Bufalino of Pittston, Pennsylvania, Appalachian alumnus and boss over a wide turf. Also in the frame, Joseph Zerilli. Provenzano and Giacalone lacked the standing to green-light a hit on Hoffa in Zerilli's territory. Bufalino's hand showed in his long ties to Provenzano and Giacalone, his calls to Quasarano and Vitale in the months before the disappearance, and his cousin William Bufalino, once Hoffa's lawyer, suddenly appearing for suspects and alibi witnesses before the grand jury. Frank Sheeran, a Delaware Teamsters president tied to Bufalino, shepherded those witnesses and was entangled with Bufalino in a labor leasing scheme that Hoffa's return could jeopardize. The motive was larger than a single scheme. Hoffa was the mob's conduit to a river of money, the Teamsters' Central States Pension Fund. FBI electronic surveillance at the Warren Juice Company in Detroit, 1961 to 1964, owned by Anthony and Vito Giacalone, captured Vito saying Mike Polizzi wouldn't have gotten a $630,000 loan without Jimmy. Jimmy had to put his stamp on it. Hoffa's sway came from union control over investment decisions. Employers didn't cross him. Assets were invested directly, not by professionals. Hoffa ran the loans. His key counselor was Alan Dorfman, stepson of Paul Dorfman, Hoffa's Chicago bridge to Anthony Accardo, Capone's heir. Before prison in 1967, Hoffa told Roy Lee Williams that Alan speaks for me on all pension fund questions. He's the guy in charge while I'm gone. Dorfman beat multiple cases, acquitted in the 1964 Chattanooga tampering case, acquitted in 1974 on embezzlement and mail fraud tied to a $1.4 million loan with Anthony Spilotro, Felix Aldericio, and bondsman Irwin Weiner. A key witness in that case, Daniel Seifert, was shotgun murdered September 27, 1974. Dorfman's one conviction, 1972, conspiracy to take a $55,000 kickback for arranging a $1.5 million loan, extracted by arguing the fund had already lost heavily on $15 million to borrower George Horvath. The loans told their own story. Typical funds park money in government bonds and keep under 2% in real estate. By 1963, Central States had $213 million in assets, 63% in real estate, 3% in treasuries, the rest in banks and corporates. In 1959 to 60, millions went to Morris Moe Dalitz of Cleveland, Hoffa's acquaintance from Detroit, to build Sunrise Hospital and bankroll the Stardust, Fremont, and Desert Inn in Las Vegas. FBI evidence later pegged those casinos for $100,000 a month in skim to Sam Giancana, Chicago, John Scalish, Cleveland, and Meyer Lansky, Miami. From 1965 to 72, $20.4 million went to Caesar's Palace, nominally owned by Jay Sarno, but identified by the FBI as fronting for mob interests in the Midwest and New England. Skimming was suspected, but not proved there. In 1971, on Dorfman's say-so, $26 million went to Circus, again through Sarno. The FBI pointed to Anthony Spilotro, called one of the most dangerous gang terrorists in the Chicago area, as the real power. In 1974, $62.7 million went to Alan Glick's Argent Corporation to buy the Stardust and Fremont. Glick installed Frank Rosenthal to run the floors. Rosenthal, Spilotro's associate and a one-time college basketball fixer, ran a sophisticated skim that stole at least $20 million, then the largest documented take. By some estimates, mob-connected loans since 1957 totaled roughly $600 million out of $1.2 billion lent by central states. Losses, $100 million in undercharged interest, $285 million in defaults. By 1974, the fund stopped lending. In 1979, under Labor Department pressure, trustees resigned and Equitable Life and Victor Palmieri and Companies took over. Real estate exposure fell from about 70% to 35%. Cash returns doubled from roughly 4% to over 9%. Seen through that lens, control of the fund, Bufalino didn't act alone. The decision likely ran through the commission. Too much money was at stake to let Hoffa take back the Union on a reform ticket. As Hoffa once said about Robert Kennedy, he's got to go. Appalachian exposed a deeper problem. Law enforcement didn't know enough. The FBI didn't know anything, really, about the Appalachian attendees, Robert Kennedy said. That changed when the Bureau leaned into microphones. By Hoover's own 1967 admission, the FBI could not have learned what it did about Cosa Nostra without electronic surveillance. The 1967 President's Commission called the system significant, noting only the FBI fully documented the national scope. Chicago lit the fuse. In 1959, agents Ralph Hill and William Romer learned mob regulars met upstairs from a restaurant on North Michigan Avenue in a tailor shop owned by Gus Alex. After Washington's OK and some Sunday morning pratfalls, an installer nearly dropped a ceiling, the team planted a World War II-era microphone behind a radiator. It worked. They heard who had power, how fixes were placed, which decisions were made, and by whom. Murray Humphreys, the outfit's fixer, narrated mob history in his own voice. It became the most reliable source on the Chicago syndicate. After Kennedy's 1961 critique of FBI intelligence, the program expanded. Bugs went in across the country. Stefano Magaddino, commission chairman and Buffalo boss, at Memorial Chapel in Niagara Falls. Sam Giancana at the Armory Lounge in Forest Park, Illinois. Angelo Bruno at Penn Jersey, vending in Philadelphia. Raymond Patriarca at National Cigarette Service in Providence. Others followed. Simone de Cavalcante at the Kenworth Corporation in Kenilworth, New Jersey. Angelo DiCarlo at the Mountain View Bar in West Orange. Michael Clemente at the Fresco Travel Bureau in New York City. The Bureau also wired targets by racket. Las Vegas counting rooms at the Stardust Fremont Desert Inn. The First Ward Democratic Office in Chicago, home base for the West Side block that bridged politics and the outfit. At any given time, 75 to 100 bugs were live, many for years. Magaddino from April 1961 to July 1965. Patriarca from March 1962 to July 1965-1965. By August 1964, Associate Director Courtney Evans could tell Alan Belmont they understood Giancana's reactions to commission business better than other bosses did, because the tapes were rolling. He added, "There's no substitute for electronic surveillance in developing hard intelligence on this underworld." Not everyone agreed. Professor Dwight C. Smith argued the National Syndicate case rested on ambiguous second- and third-hand interpretations, colored by what listeners expected to hear: boasts, lies, manipulation mixed with facts. Journalist Jonathan Quitney shot back, "Read the transcripts, many cut before The Godfather and before Valachi, and it's hard to deny a tight-knit organization with strict membership rules and ultimate authority over its people, superior to family or country, dedicated to illegal profit." Surely grown men would not sit around reminiscing about how they had participated together in various events unless those events really happened, he wrote. They might exaggerate, they don't hallucinate.